One of the things about our show is it's going to be unique.
You are what you do. You can say any amount of things that you want to say, but what you do is what everybody sees.
People are like, oh, I'm just going to JV it. Like, it's just JV it. Like, what the hell is that mean?
I cannot tell you how excited I am to hang out with you guys today, so thank you so much.
Well, then that end buyer could come back and say, well, I didn't fully understand that it was subject to.
That's not a thing. Like, the SEC has thought of all of these things. They've been here since 1932.
And you can do what you want with your property.
Buyers have time, they have negotiating power, they have options.
Oh my gosh, I am blown away by your inexperience, and they've been in business 20 years.
And that includes things other people put on your property, right? It's your property to be okay. Suddenly, Cousin Jimmy's in a lawsuit.
A novation is replacing one contract or one obligation with another.
Out with the old, in with the new.
Yes.
Everybody, and welcome to the show. Today, our topic is falling in love with creative finance. I'm Andy Fowler, and I'm here with Sean St. Clair. If you're new to the show, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. You can find us on X, Facebook, and YouTube. On all of those platforms, you can find us at the handle @InRem Podcast. That's @InRem Podcast. Also, whether it be Spotify, Apple, or another podcast platform, you can download an audio version of the podcast. Go there, download, like, and subscribe. As always, helps us out a ton. With that, we're going to go to Sean, who has our legal update.
Thank you, Andy. So our legal update today is an update on the Corporate Transparency Act. So another show, another update on the Corporate Transparency Act. So a little bit of a change, nothing that just yet that has happened that's requiring immediate action in filing the beneficial ownership information. But if you remember the last update that I provided, the United States Supreme Court had lifted the injunction in the Top Chop case, and which everyone thought, oh, that means that all of a sudden we have to file the beneficial ownership information. But then there was this other case that was decided in Texas as well, called the Smith case. And in that case, the court also issued a nationwide injunction. Well, that injunction was still in place. No appeal had ever been made of that injunction. And so FinCEN had put on its website, hey, we're still bound by this federal court injunction in the Smith case, so no need to file any beneficial ownership information. So everyone was thinking, well, with the administration change, a new attorney general, a new treasury secretary, a new president, like, you know, that, and it seems that, you know, that administration seems to be more limited government, that hey, they're just going to let this thing sit, let it work its way through the courts, have a final determination regarding its constitutionality, and not require any type of reporting. Well, that's not what happened. So last week, the FinCEN, through the Department of Justice, ended up filing an appeal in the Smith case. Now that appeal is pending, and they're actually asking the district court to lift the injunction, the nationwide injunction, on the basis of the Supreme Court precedent, which did it in the Top Chop case. So what does this mean? This means right now nothing's changed, but in all likelihood there will be a change, because presumably the judge in the Smith case is going to recognize the federal precedent set by the U.S. Supreme Court, and that judge will honor that precedent and lift the nationwide injunction, which means that all of a sudden now the beneficial ownership requirements must be met, and you'll have to report that information. But there's more. And in the appeal paperwork that the Department of Justice submitted, they said, well, first, we're going to give at least a 30-day reprieve, and during this 30 days, we're going to take a look and analysis of the reporting requirements and decide whether or not to adjust those. And then you think, well, wait a minute, this is a Corporate Transparency Act. How does FinCEN have the ability to adjust those reporting requirements. Well, the Corporate Transparency Act basically gave FinCEN the discretion and ability to decide which businesses have to report, as well as what information has to be reported. So that wasn't part of the act. That act didn't say, oh, well, every LLC with less than $5 million in gross revenue must report, or that we need the driver's license and addresses and all this detailed information from the beneficial ownership individuals. Instead, it gave FinCEN that ability. So FinCEN's the one that came up with the rules as to what businesses must report. They came up with what information must be submitted, and frankly, even some of the deadlines are all FinCEN's doing. So if the rule can be promulgated, the rule can be revised, amended, or even set aside. So it'll be interesting to see, once this judge presumably lifts this stay, or injunction, and reporting requirements now have to be done. It'll be interesting to find out what is the exact timeframes that are going to be laid down by FinCEN, what changes to the current rules are going to be made, what companies may or may not have to report. In fact, FinCEN in its brief said they're going to analyze it to see how they can limit the reporting requirements or exclude certain U.S. small businesses from reporting, right? Because ultimately what they're trying to figure out is, where's the foreign ownership? That's what they're trying to figure out, determine foreign ownership of LLCs and whether or not that's proper, whether or not money is being laundered. They really, at least as to this administration, it doesn't seem like they're inclined to really want to know about like a U.S. owned LLC. But how are you going to be able to separate, the information out? What information do you really need? What companies really need to report? So there's a lot that will have to be fleshed out. Who knows? They could say, nope, we're not going to change anything. This is the only way to obtain the information. And then at some point in the not so near distant future, all of these, for those that have been holding off on filing their beneficial ownership interest reports, you're going to have to start filing. But there's still a lot up in the air, and it's never changing. So, we don't know whether or not what kind of adjustments are going to be made. And, like FinCEN could keep it the way it is, they could also gut it and basically not require much reporting at all, if at any. So it really is just up in the air at this point. But there has been movement. There has been an appeal filed that should result in the reporting requirements being reactivated. And then the question is are any changes to those reporting requirements going to be made?
All right, Sean, thank you for the legal update. Reminder, this afternoon at 3 p.m. Arizona time is the Creative Finance Collective. That is an opportunity for lawyers and professionals in the space to get on a live stream together and discuss creative finance, what we're seeing, what's working, what's not working, what the law says with respect to creative finance in different states. We get together and we talk about it, but we're really there to answer questions from you, the listener, the party that's interested in learning more about creative finance, what it looks like, benefits, disadvantages, risks that might be associated with it. We attack that from all angles. So that's your opportunity to be a part of it. We're there until we stop receiving questions. So if you have a question, this is your moment. This is your opportunity to talk with lawyers in the space about it. That's 3 p.m. Arizona time. You can find that on Facebook, X, or YouTube. It's right on our NREM podcast channel. Make sure to be there with us. We'd enjoy seeing you there and answering your questions. All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and get into our topic today. The month of February is what we're calling our Falling in Love series, and we're talking about different aspects and respects of real estate and talking with investors who have fallen in love with that area and how they got into doing it. And today our topic is falling in love with creative finance. And with us to discuss that is real estate investor Mark Monroe. Mark, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah. Thank you guys for having me, gentlemen. I appreciate it. It's always
Yeah,
a pleasure, always chatting with you guys, especially, in the creative seller financing world.
yeah, we knew when we wanted to have this topic, and we've had you on a couple times, but in talking about creative finance, we thought, boy, we'd love to hear from Mark about this and the background, so on and so forth. So as we get into this, we're probably going to talk about background and what you've done a little bit more than we've done in the past. So I won't get into too much of that on the front end here, other than to introduce you to some of our listeners. You've actually authored a book on creative finance. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about that and how they can find that?
I did. Thank you. Yeah, so I end up, what happened was, speaking of Palm Desert, before we went on, we were talking about the weather, Palm Spring, Palm Desert. Well, what happened was a couple years ago, my other half's father was ill. So we're out there taking care of him. And during that time period, everybody's always asked me over the years, why don't you write a book? Why don't you write a book? And I always put it off. And then I actually went through the process, wrote the book. It was one of the best sellers on Amazon. And it figures a couple months later, ChatGTP comes out, after going through that whole entire process, because ChatGTP is just so much easier helping with those type of things nowadays. But yeah, I just kind of talked about it, kind of gave everybody a different variety of different creative seller financing strategies, the big things, the subject to, agreement for deed, land contracts, sandwich lease options, novations. There's so many different types of creative seller financing strategies. So thank you so much for bringing that up. But yeah, you can get it on Amazon if you're interested in the book as well. But it's just all out there, and especially with the higher interest rates, this is the prime opportunity to be able to take these type of deals down, because a lot of times, these sellers, the properties are not moving as quickly.
Yeah. So one question, kind of to take a little bit of a temperature, we've talked about in the past the importance of having some diversity in your approach to what your real estate investment strategies are, because every year, every market's going to offer the real estate investor different opportunities, different challenges. So we're really at the beginning of 2025. What are you, from a real estate investment strategy? Is there a particular area you're focused on, excited about? What does 2025 look like for you?
I love it. I mean, it's just like last year. Last year's been a great year. There's another year coming up. When the market has higher rates, there's great opportunities to find properties that are not moving. Even when the market was lower interest rates, when everybody was doing wholesaling, I was always doing a creative seller financing strategy. And it's just, you got to find the opportunity to be able to take these down. And I like the markets where the 1% rule works really well, like the Midwest, where the rents, you can buy a property 150, 200,000 and get between $2,000 to $3,000 on the rents on those. I kind of like that. The Florida market is a little bit challenging right now. We've been underwriting deals, and when we look at a seller financing strategy, like we just did one last week in Orlando, where the payment was going to be $700 higher than what the current market rents are. So in that case, I will tend to, in the Florida market, I'm leaning more towards doing what's called a sandwich lease option, where I go under contract with a seller, and allowing me to sublet, and I put my tenant buyer into that property, because the numbers tend to make a little bit. So it's a market by market, depending on what strategy to use. And then the other strategy really comes down to is listening to the seller and finding out really what the seller is trying to accomplish in their needs. And the key to it, the key to doing these creative seller financing strategies, you have to think of it like a marriage. You're in a contract with these people for 3, 5, 7, 10 years, whatever it may be. So when you're having these conversations with sellers, get to know them. Think of your spouse when you first went on that date with your spouse or significant other. Treat it getting to know each other. They're interviewing you to make sure you're going to do what you're telling you to do, and then you're interviewing them to make sure they're not a crazy seller. We've all had those.
So as we break down and kind of look at your journey into the creative finance space, I want to just briefly back up even further than that. What really got you first excited about real estate investing? What brought you into that space?
To be frank, I grew up in Vermont. in poverty. My father left when I was 6 or 7, and I remember it was like this time of year. Um, we had fuel. There was the heating, and my mother had no money for fuel, so we all had to sleep on the floor because it was electric stove. And then for 3 months straight, for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 3 months straight, all we ate was Kraft macaroni and cheese out of a box. So the only time I had good food was like when I went to the school. So, and then I had to help um, work, snow plow, shovel, mow lawns, whatever it may be to help put food on the table. And then I also had a severe case of ADHD on top of it. So I was always put in front of the class. I was always that troublemaker that because I couldn't sit still. And then and then I started working, believe it or not, at McDonald's at the age of 15. And my ADHD, I excelled, did really well. And I was a senior in high school running a store, and I started learning business. But and then during that time period, I ordered a book, Carlton Sheets, or the manual course or whatever it is. And I did my first deal when I was 19. It was a mobile home. I just put, we buy houses. I threw up on the telephone pole. We buy houses, and I was 19 years old. I didn't realize that it's illegal putting signs up on telephone poles. The municipality called me up, said, "Hey, go take this thing down." I'm like, I'm sorry, I didn't know. So what happened during that time? This guy called me up and said, "Hey, I got this mobile home for sale. It's worth $21,000. Give me 18." I'm like, I don't want a mobile home. Calls me back a week later. He goes, "Give me $15,000. It's worth 21,000." I'm like, I told you I'm not interested in a mobile home. Another week goes by. He calls me back, goes, "Give me $12,000. It's worth 21." I'm like, "Do you own the land?" He goes, "No, it's in a mobile home park." I'm like, "Dude, no offense, I'm not interested." Threw it away. I called the boomerang. A month later, he calls me back. He goes, "Give me $6,000 worth. It's 21,000." Now I knew it was a deal. I'm like, "Well, why are you selling it?" He goes, "I don't live in it. It's a mobile home park, and I don't have the money really for a lot." I'm like, "I told you I'm not interested, but this is what I'll do to help you out. I'll give you $3,000. Goes, "Oh no, give me, I want 4,000." I'm like, "I'm not interested." He goes, "Okay." We agreed to the 3,000. I'm like, "Okay." I have to send somebody out to look at the property. I had to go to like an office supply store because we didn't have the internet then. So I had to do a contract. Well, I hung up the phone, placed an ad in the newspaper, classified paper, mobile home for sale for $25,000, owner financing with $3,000 down. First lady called me up. They went out and looked at it. They wanted it immediately. They gave me the $3,000. I took that $3,000, gave it to the seller. I created a note at like 7.5 or 8% for 7 years. It was $300 a month. That was my car payment, insurance. When I was 19 years old. So that was my really first deal. And then I got sucked in the corporate world for about 5 years, and then I got back into it when I was like 24, 25 full time.
It's funny. We for February, I mentioned we've been doing this, uh, um, this the love of real estate series, and our last guest that we spoke with last week, we were talking about different ways they got in, and some some folks spend a ton of time preparing, almost paralysis by analysis, a lot of work going in on the front end, and other folks just dive right in. Sounds like you just dove right in.
I did. I had no clue what I was doing. I'm sure the paperwork was screwed up. I guarantee you the paperwork was probably screwed up. I didn't use it. I just went and did a bill of sale, created just a promissory note, if you will, and and then we had to do the whole. It was because it was more like a motor vehicle type of transaction. A mobile home is a little bit different, but
Yeah.
it worked. I had no clue what I was doing. So yeah, I just dived in, and I'm like, I had nothing to lose, and just went with it.
Yeah, so coming out of so you said you did that deal, went into the corporate world for a little while. What drew you back out of the corporate world back into real estate?
So what happened was I was in New England, and I was transferring down to the Washington, Baltimore, DC area. And I was going to be in charge of like close to 80 stores. Um, but during that time period, when you're with them for almost 10 years, you get 2 months paid vacation plus your. So I wanted to learn more about real estate, and I took this course, it was a loan origination course, and I took the course, and it was about a week, and the instructor said, "Hey, why don't you come work for me?" So I had another month and a half. I went to work with him, and my first month I made like $25,000. I'm like, wow,
Mm.
I'm used to making a lot less than that. But that was on the subprime world of mortgage loans back then. And then what happened was I was there for about a year, met my partners. We ended up starting our own firm. It was a mortgage broker firm at first, but eventually we ended up blowing it up. We became a real estate banking firm. We had a warehouse line with Mellon Bank, and we had 107 loan officers that was working for us. And during that time period, a lot of my clients were investors I became friends with. And I started surrounding myself with like-minded individuals, and that's what really pulled me up. And then I started doing my first type of creative deals, was what's called a sandwich lease option. The market around like 96, 97, the market slowed a little bit. The rates jumped up, and seconds were very popular back then. I don't remember if you guys remember that. Like, even got to 125s at one point. But that was a little bit later on. So I started asking sellers, hey, would you be willing to sell your property on a rent to own to me? And they're like, oh, I need my capital to go buy another property. Well, me being a loan originator at that time, I would refinance. I said, this is what I'll do. I'll refinance your property, and we'll take that cash and you can use that cash. We'll do it at like an 80% loan to value. And back then the arms were very popular because the rates were around like 7.5, almost where they're at now, 7.5, 8%. So I'd do like a 5-1 arm. So the interest rate was like in the mid fives. So I'd do that for about, it was fixed for like 2 years. So I'd refinance a property, and I'd say, oh, by the way, Mr. Seller, I want to do your new loan on your other property. Um, and then I would put a tenant buyer in the property, and they would put an option fee down. So on one deal, I was getting on one lead, I was getting 3 different deals. I was making like $35,000 on the 2 loans and putting a tenant buyer in. Nowadays, the regulations change so much; it's probably a big no-no to do that. But back then, you could do that, and it was a win for everybody. It was a win for the seller, help them out, and then I put my tenant buyer in the property, and then they end up eventually owning that property in about 3 years later.
Now, how long were you in the space generally, before you kind of identified that first creative finance strategy or opportunity?
I was probably a year in that space, learning how to do that one because, we all go through the whole fix and flip model, become landlords. That was usually the journey, and that was my original journey for in '95. That was my first one, and then about mid to '96, and then straight into '97 because again the market shifted and homes weren't selling, and we were doing a lot of seconds, but I saw homes that were sitting on the market for about 4 or 5, 6 months, and these people were moving, and so what happened was this person called me up one time and said, hey, I moved, I have this property, so I need to refinance it and take some cash to help survive. And I'm like, hey, would you be open to selling this property and rent to own to me? And then kind of I just stumbled into that, and that was that strategy. So I did that strategy for a few years. Then I did the land contract strategy for a few years, subject to. So each of these strategies, I was in those strategies for a couple of years before I moved on to another strategy.
Now, how much were these moves dictated? It sounds like they were dictated pretty heavily by market conditions at the time. It's like it makes me think during the great financial crisis or right before it, nobody thought they were going to become a short sale expert. And then everybody was forced to basically go learn how to be a short sale expert, whether they liked it or not. It sounds like the market was giving you something and you either had to adapt or die at the time.
Absolutely. All the time. As us being entrepreneurs, the market is always shifting. Um, it could be government regulations that make us shift our strategies. It could be the market, are we going into a recession? Even when the market was hot there, for a good 10 years, the strategy, I was still doing seller financing, but wholesaling was the big thing. That's where everybody jumped in. They did the wholesaling and then, subject to came around. Subject to was always around for a good 30, 40 years. And it's evolving again, especially with the internet nowadays. It makes it so much easier for people to learn these type of strategies. It was very hard back then when we didn't have the internet. I actually had to find mentors to really teach me. And I was bird dogs for a lot of these people that would, if I want, like, I remember learning the subject to strategy. I had to be a bird dog for somebody, and he learned through, I think Lou Brown. That was the one of those, and then Ron LeGrand. That's where a lot of these guys. So I went under a wing of somebody. I was still a loan officer doing that and doing these other strategies. I'm like, oh, I want to learn this subject too. So I was a bird dog. I was taking some of my lease option deals and bringing them over to him, and we're doing them on a subject too, using the Lou Brown and Ron LeGrand and stuff. And there was another guy back in the day, even William Bronchek, some of his stuff. We kind of go through that whole path. So that's kind of where we learned way back then. We're talking late '90s type of thing.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. How did you as you were forced into this, how did you learn? There really probably weren't books on the topic, and it was basically finding the mentors in the space. I mean, how were you able to basically find those folks? Was it just heavy networking in the space?
There was a lot of heavy networking, because I was a loan originator. I was forcing myself to be around other investors, and I started mainly they were fix and flip investors that I was doing some loans for. We're doing some hard money loans, and then I started going to different events. And then back in the day, those guys used to come around to the hotels and do their presentations. Ron LeGrand, Lou Brown, they still technically do it, but that's how that stuff got out there. And they were selling a course to other investors, and I just became a bird dog for one of them through, and was kind of networking. That's how I learned it. I was just I pretty much didn't make any money on those first couple of deals because I just wanted to learn from a different mentor in a sense. um so that's kind of how I fell into it, just going through these different strategies. And nowadays with the internet, I mean, it's so easy jumping on YouTube and kind of educating yourself. And you got to be careful. I mean, subject to is an extremely advanced strategy, and you really need to know what you're doing and make sure you have proper guidance. I see, you guys are always like, where I think we're in my group right now, the seller finance group, is a lot of people in there. And I see so many new people coming in and trying to do a sub two deal, and they have no clue what they're doing. I'm like, hey, take a step back here, because you need to know subject to is a great strategy if it's done correctly, but you need to know what you're doing, and you need to make sure you have some reserves. And I always tell people you should stay in the deal and not do assignments so you can control the deal if something happens.
So fast forwarding to today, you've developed knowledge and experience with a number of strategies, right? So whether that's a wrap transaction, a agreement for deed or land contract, depending on what state you're in, a lease option. And you mentioned, doing a transaction down in Florida using a lease option. What are some of the factors that you look at to decide, okay, which strategy do I want to use for any particular property or transaction?
Regulations. Regulations determine a lot on my exit strategies. For an example, we've talked about this before. I did a lease option one time in a state that wasn't landlord friendly. And typically in a lease option, when you're putting a tenant buyer into the property, you want them to be responsible for maintenance and repairs. So some states, you got to be really cautious, because then if something goes bad, they're going to throw it back. Now it becomes landlord tenant law. Guess who's responsible at that point?
Right.
So you got to be very cautious. In Texas, you can't do. I stay out of Texas because of the different regulations, but I've heard people, you can do lease options, but you can only do it for a year, and you have to be the primary owner. You guys probably know a little bit better than that than I do, but a lot of states will determine on the regulations. Even I think up in Detroit area, that within the past year, they came down with some regulations on agreement for deeds or land contracts, where you have to underwrite them like through an RMLO to make sure they qualify, which you need to, and I highly recommend that. And that's where a lot of people go wrong. They just are looking for that large assignment fee and just throwing that buyer in a property and not even making sure they can qualify. And that's what you really need to make sure, because if not, I've seen it happen. People will just look for that large down payment. They don't care what that buyer's income is, and then that buyer can't afford that property. So you got to be careful, because what happens is in states, regulations constantly change all the time, and you really need to make sure you have a great attorney in those states that knows those type of regulations that can guide you through it, because each state has their own little rules and regulations depending on certain strategies. Like you said, like a lease option, some states have them. Florida is very friendly for lease options, so if they stop paying, you can have them out in about 45 days versus some other states. So, and you got to be careful how you word it and set them up, because you can also set it up where, if you're giving them credit, if you're counting it as a down payment versus an option fee, then it opens a whole different type of rules and regulations. And Sean, you probably can answer to that. And maybe you can give some insights, because people are, they hear me right now and, oh, that's a great strategy, but you have to understand about it, because it could be considered equitable interest. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So a couple of points. So first, lease options are a great strategy until you have another epidemic or pandemic and they tell your tenant they don't have to pay your rent, So that's one. But on top of that, you have to structure the lease and the option properly. So the lease document should never ever reference the option. It should be a standalone lease agreement like any other lease agreement. Then you have your option agreement, and your option can reference the lease, but only for the purposes of saying that it's a lease and performance requirement in order to exercise the option. Meaning, if you've been evicted, if you're in default under the lease, then you can't buy the property until you fix it. So you have your option, and then your option should not have any provision in there stating that any portion of the lease is going towards the purchase price, nor should it have, like you said, a down payment. It should be an option fee. And in most states, you do not have a valid option unless you actually have an option fee, because it requires consideration. So there's legal precedent to say, look, I have to charge you an option fee. I don't have the choice not to. If you want this to be a valid document, because it has to have separate consideration. So that's how to properly structure it, at least in Arizona and Wisconsin, where I'm licensed. But I think that's pretty common throughout the country if you're going to use that strategy in states, to your point, that allow for that strategy. Like Texas doesn't really allow for it. And there's other states that aren't landlord friendly that you may not want to think twice about doing it.
Mark, another transactional strategy is to use a trust. And I'm curious, you mentioned regulations, and you come from a state where, the regulations are pretty friendly to trust. In fact, it's got an entire body of statutes designed around the trust, whereas in most other states don't. So coming from a state like that, how often are you wanting to or trying to use a trust, if at all?
I put all my properties into a trust. Now in Florida, they do different ways of the closing of a trust. You could do assignment of beneficiaries and stuff like that. I still go through the regular process of regular transaction, because you want to make sure, because some of these people try to get around that paying the transfer taxes, and the state revenue is going to want to come after you. So I go through the process and still close on it, and I just have the buyer, and even my contract, I have the trust name as the buyer, treat it as a traditional closing. That's how I do mine. But there is ways how they structure it, and I just don't feel comfortable doing that way. I know people do it. I know attorneys out there doing it, and which, hey, it works. Go for it. I just like to have my transactions all done the same way in every state. The buyer's a trust, close on it, do the HUD, do the note, do the exact same regular transactions on closings. That's how I do mine. But again, I know in Florida, there are some people just do a different type of closing, assignment of beneficiary within the trust. Trusts are great, and it's helps. Just want to be careful. It doesn't stop the due on sales clause. A lot of people think, oh, if I put in a trust, it stops the due on sales. It's not true. It still can happen. And you guys can probably talk about that. It does create a little anonymity. It helps a little bit, because a lot of times it's done for estate purposes. So it helps create it. Plus, you as an investor, it helps create anonymity. So say, for example, one of your properties, somebody falls down and gets injured, the attorney is going to look it up and see, oh, this guy owns all these assets, let's go after him. But if you have in a trust, it's really difficult to see, unless they get, if you're subpoenaed and you're in deposition, that's a whole different story. But on the surface, attorneys, I call them, you guys aren't like that, but some of them are ambulance chasers, I call them. They're just going to look up and see, all right, how much can we shake this guy down for? And I've been there. They've shaken me down. I got to know the guy, and they usually say, oh, what we do is we look up your net worth, and we usually ask for about 10%, because we know you're just going to sign a check and go away. I was like, oh, okay. So, but that's part of the game. When you're been in this game long enough, you're going to come across almost everything.
So if I understand correctly, and I will tell you, this is the way that in states that don't have statutory land trusts like Florida, this is how I believe that trust should be utilized. And so let's break that down. So you basically create the trust as the buyer, and then the trust is the actual buyer under the purchase contract.
That's how I do mine.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like when you do a purchase, the buyer is the name of the trust. And then you sign, then the trustee is the one that signs on behalf of the trust.
Now, who do you make as the trustee normally on your trust?
It depends. It could be my attorney. It could be the closing agent. It depends on the state.
Mhm.
There is different companies out there in states because you got to be careful because sometimes, in Florida, you could use like I can buy a property in North Carolina using a Florida trust, but North Carolina may require the trustee to be in that state. So you got to know your rules and regulations and consult with an attorney in those states if you're going to do using a trust. Again, I'm not an attorney, but you want to consult with an attorney in those states to make sure that you're doing it correctly in that state. But I know more and more people are using, and I do a lot of that. I use my Florida trust to buy properties in other states, but you just got to, and I guess it's the, I've talked to an attorney, and I guess there's been some cases that actually held up, and they're okay using the Florida trust in other states from, so you
Mhm.
guys will probably know better
Right.
than I would on that.
Yeah. So if you acquire a property in the trust and then you're going to do a disposition, are you doing a straight up sale, whether by, say land contract or wrap to the buyer, or are you assigning the beneficial interest of the trust to the buyer?
I typically stay in all my deals. I don't do a lot of assignments. When I used to, back in the day, I would do assignments. But in the last 7, 8 years, I've always held on my stuff. Once in a while, like if a deal doesn't work, um, because the monthly payments won't work, I will tell the seller and I'll sign it back to the seller. I've done that a couple times. Like, hey, Mr. Seller, I need my monthly payment to be at this for the deal to work for me, but it may not work for me, but I may have somebody and I'll take like a small, I'm not a pig at all on my assignment fees, maybe a few $1,000s just to help the buyer and help the process of it. But I don't do a lot of those. I try to structure them and where I stay right in the deal. But yeah, you can do that. You can do an assignment. You can sell your trust, if you will, to somebody else.
Right.
There's different ways of doing that stuff. And do you guys do many of those?
Well, in Arizona, we're limited on trusts. I mean, you can do them. The problem is there is no anonymity, because on our deed, on the face of the deed, you have to disclose the names and addresses of each beneficiary of the trust. So let's say in the way you structure them, let's say you go and you create a trust and you name, say, your LLC as the beneficiary of the trust. So when we go and purchase the property in the name of the trust, we're going to have to put on the deed itself that the beneficiaries is, LLC. And so the lender looking at it is going to be like, oh, okay, well, this isn't like an estate planning trust. And then to your point, attorney or someone else that's trying to examine assets are going to be like, hey, this is, this LLC. And then they can start putting the pieces of the puzzle together.
Arizona is one of the tough states on that particular one.
Yes.
So, Mark, you walked us through a little bit earlier, kind of the evolution of what creative finance is looked like, or your experience with it from the 90s, and then just working forward. You also talked about, you're the type of investor that, yeah, the market's presenting us with this opportunity. Let's get in. Let's do it. We'll learn along the way. So you've got a long track record of doing that. But over the course of your career, looking back on being involved in creative finance, when you move quick, sometimes you break things. So looking back, what mistakes do you feel like that you made along the way, which, by the way, happen to usually be our best our best schooling, right? They make us what we are, but what kind of mistakes along the way did you see in learning creative finance?
Sure. Majority of it, the mistakes are contracts. Using the wrong contract in the wrong state. That's usually what it comes down to, because something may happen. That's usually, when you're young and you're trying to save money to try to do everything and try to take shortcuts to save a penny, it costs you a lot more money than the long run. I would say that's probably one of the biggest ones is using the wrong, like a lease option contract in the wrong state. Also, if you ever go to remove somebody, if you have a lease option and a tenant buyer in that property, you'd remove them and make sure the attorney knows how that process. I had an attorney one time go in there and try to evict, and in this estate, they automatically got legal aid, and the legal aid smoked my attorney. And what happened was, oh, they're going to go, Your Honor, we're going in and they just want to do the eviction, right? So let's just use the lease agreement. Let's throw out the purchase and sales contract of it. So they threw out the purchase and sale contract, and now it's just landlord tenant law. And they came up with over $20,000 of repairs of receipts that supposedly they did. So you want to make sure you keep those contracts together if you're going through that process. So you got to be careful. Because like Florida, you want to just go in with a lease agreement, but some states you got to be really careful because in some states it may have to go through like almost like a foreclosure process versus an eviction. You guys will probably know the difference than I would in the different court levels, but that's probably one of the biggest mistakes I've learned. And then just make sure if you're using GCs, just do your due diligence. A lot of people don't know. Good people, like one of my people, I do a little mentorship, and one of my people now hired a GC, and it came from a referral. And this GC turned out to be a nightmare. I had no clue, and I feel bad for her. And she's about $40,000 over budget. So that's probably the other thing. And most of investors, we all try to go through the fix and flip. That's the norm. That's how we start. And usually we end up getting hurt because costs went way over, and a lot of people end up going under because of that, or the market pulled back and they didn't do the numbers correctly. Probably those were the biggest things. And you learn from your mistakes, and immediately I can see something that's going to be a problem and I can identify it immediately. And like, so when I always look at a deal, I always look at why is the seller selling? What are they planning on doing with the capital? Because if you could figure those out, that's how you can do it. And then what's my risk? I always look at the risk. A lot of young people come in, they don't care about risk. They just want deals. You have to look at risk, because I can't tell you how many times over the years I see people come in doing the first deal or two, they get burned, and then they're gone. They're out of the industry. So just understand the risks.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting, I thought about this as you were describing choosing wrong contracts or just moving fast. A lot of real estate investors now, they take for granted the fact that they have this thing called Google, right? And it makes their life so easy in terms of you can find anything out there, right? When we talk about a creative finance transaction, we're talking about a complex contractual transaction that is outside the norm, right? It's outside, forms that whatever Department of Real Estate in any given state might provide to a real estate agent or whatever else. These are unique types of situations. Well, nowadays we can search that on Google and we can find it. Now, half the time we're finding the wrong forms and we're getting ourselves into all other kinds of problems because those different forms are so readily available, and maybe we're not giving them the attention that they need. But that, I'm not sure, was the case in the 90s, in the mid 90s, when you were looking at that. These forms were not readily available. When you were approaching back then new, exotic, creative type transactions in real estate, what did you have to do as an investor to kind of bird dog that form, find it and develop it and work through it?
It was so easy. You only had to do just a couple forms, really, like a one-page contract, maybe a two-page. It was so simple. You didn't have to have all these disclosures. Even on the loan world, I remember it was like 8 pages. Nowadays, it's like 800 pages when you do these documents at closing or whatever. Just disclose, 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 disclose. Um, just because deals going bad, people get hurt, lawsuits come up, and then let's do another disclosure document. So it kind of helps protect them. But my opinion is, and I see a lot of these people like doing deals and like, oh, my contract's solid, I'm not going to get sued. It doesn't matter what your contract says, you can still get pulled into a lawsuit, you know. So, but these people think that like, oh, my contract's solid, I'm not going to get sued, I'm perfectly fine, I'm walking on gold. I see that, but it doesn't matter how strong your contract is, you still could get sued, and then it's all negotiating at that point.
Well, and that raises a point that you made earlier, which is you try to stay in your transactions. And for me, that is one of the best protections that you can have from lawsuits, which is keep the seller happy, and do what you agreed to do. Yeah.
Always take care of your seller. You have to.
Yeah.
That's the top priority. No matter what in that transaction, that seller's top priority, his mortgage is top priority. They are top priority. You will lose. You want to make sure you lose money before that seller does. And that's why if you do it the right way and you get a good enough down payment from your tenant buyer and you hold it in reserves, so if something does happen, you have that reserves. And that's where I can't stress it enough. And a lot of people don't do this. You have to have reserves to help carry, especially if you're new in this business. And always be constantly communication with the buyer and seller, because if you have a good relationship with the buyers and there's something that's coming up, they're going to reach out to you ahead of time before you have to chase them. And that's where I'm at now with most of my people. Like, I have a couple now, like somebody has an issue with one of their social security. Before even the first, they've even reached out to me and said, hey, I'm going to be a few days late because there's an issue with my social security, blah, blah, blah. They're good people. And if you have really good relationships with the people, you can make it, it's a win for everybody. I had a deal one time where I sold on a lease option, and I sold it them for 214,000. And in my agreements, they're supposed to notify me 90 days before that they're going to exercise their option. And these people are good. I've only talked to them, a few times. There is a Florida. Just I reached out because a hurricane went through. They're really good people. Well, day 45 came. I haven't heard from them. I'm like, hey, are you guys going to want to purchase this property? I'm like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Now, granted, this is when the market, the prices were going crazy. I sold it to them for $214,000. Their appraisal came in at 265,000. I could have been a jerk, like, hey man, sorry, you breached your contract, you didn't notify it. But they're good people, and so they end up getting $50,000 of equity in that deal. I bought it from my seller for 179,000. So I still made well. I made cash flow because I went under contract with 179, sold it to my end buyer for 215. And when he purchased it, it was $265,000. So he had almost 50K in equity in that thing.
Yeah. And to your point, there's a lot of investors who would have been like, nope, option is canceled. And I mean, on the
Did the right
89th day, they would have been like, nope, you're a day late. Sorry. But you did the right thing. And as a result, the seller's happy, you're happy, your end buyer's happy. And it's just a good,
I was perfectly fine. I made very good money on that deal.
right.
I didn't have to be greedy, and it's
Right.
just, and then those things will come back. They'll send you referrals. You just do the right
Right.
thing and they'll always come back to you.
That's right.
So, Mark, there's kind of two pieces I want to ask about with the creative finance transaction as we kind of bring this thing from a close. And it's important to have strategy and thought going into both the acquiring and into the disposition of real estate by creative finance. On the acquisition side of things, so if you're meeting with new folks, I know you got a huge Facebook group with a lot of folks that have an interest in creative finance. Maybe they've asked this question, but if you had one piece of advice on the acquisition of real estate using creative finance to somebody new, or maybe to somebody with experience, what would that one piece of advice be?
Know your seller, understand why they're selling, and how to be able to solve their problems. That's probably the biggest thing. I had a deal with one of my members. I'll just give you a quick example. This property was in Georgia. The seller was open to seller financing. He was selling it for 128,000, but he wanted $30,000 down. It didn't make sense. So I got on the phone. I started building a rapport with the seller, with my member, and I got to know him. I got to know the most important thing at that moment was his dog. I understood he has 5 children, grandchildren, huge Atlanta Falcons fan. He banks with a credit union. He has good credit. He lost his wife and is retired. So I started talking to him. I go, and he got to know me too. So that conversation goes on for about 30 minutes. So I said, hey, Robert, what do you plan on doing at $30,000? He goes, oh, I need $25,000 for a camper. I want spending money. I go, a camper? What do you plan on doing with a camper? So he said, oh, I'm going to go camping on the New River and Shenandoah Mountains into Virginia, Ohio, and Tennessee. He was going up there. So I started asking questions, like think of just real quick, think of you guys the last time you guys went camping. Who was there? What were your vision? So I had him visualize what his life's like. I asked him all those questions, what's he going to be doing? So I spent some time there. So he's taking him there on that journey. Then I brought him back. I go, hey, I noticed you've been trying to sell this for about 2 months. What seems to be the problem? He goes, everybody's beating me up in the down payment. They're offering me a low down payment. I go, how many offers you've had? He goes, I've had about 10 to 15 offers from different investors. I go, Robert, nobody's going to put $30,000 down on $120,000 home when they can go get an investor loan and put less capital down. But this is what I'll do. I'll give you $3,500 down. You mentioned that you bank with a credit union. Go ahead and take a loan out for the camper for the $25,000. And what I'll do on the 20th of every month, we'll automatically have the funds pulled out of our account and sent directly to the credit union to make the payment on your behalf. And what we did is we created Gmail just for that portal. So whenever there's a notice that goes out, it goes to you and it also goes to my bookkeeper. We got that deal for $3,500. $3,500, and we're still cash flowing $475 a month because I listened to him, I understood his problem, and I came up with a creative solution. And he felt comfortable with me because I spent time and he got to know me that I'm going to do the right thing.
Now flip it to the seller side. You're working with investors who now they own the property. They followed your advice. Hopefully they did, and they met with lawyers and they got the acquisition side done right. Now comes the, turn this thing around and on the sell side. So the disposition side, what one piece of advice would you have for an investor as they're thinking about selling?
Really, really do your background check. Make sure they're good people that can afford the property. Run them through an RMLO, even on the lease options. Technically, you don't need to, but I still run them through it to make sure that they're going to follow the guidance of the loan officer to make sure that they're doing everything correctly so they can get their financing. And I like to find nice homes in nice areas for good families that want to become homeowners and they can't qualify through the regular bank. They're so appreciative that they have the opportunity to become home ownership. And when they do become homeowners, it's such a great feeling that you help them out on their journey. And you as an investor can make a few dollars along the way. But those are the big things. Just, make sure they have good income, make sure, and then the other thing is this is really, really critical because a lot of times they're putting all the money down in that home. If it's an older home, make sure you get a home warranty because if something goes wrong in that property, say it's like an AC or something goes, 2 months later, they're not going to have any money to be able to put down. And that's where deals tend to have issues and things can blow up. So as an older home, and if you're taking all their down payment, make sure you have a good backup plan in place to help them out if something does go wrong.
Yeah, that's a good piece. I haven't heard that one before, but make sure that makes a ton of sense though, because a lot of those buyers we've all been there, right? Especially if it's your first home or whatever else, every bit of capital you have goes into that thing and there's nothing left for the repairs.
Right. So, especially in older homes, you want to make sure. Newer homes, you could be a little bit okay, but for $500 or $600, it's no big deal, doing a home warranty for a year or two on it.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, Mark, this has been really good information. Tell our listeners what's the best way to kind of follow you, and connect with you.
If you're on Facebook, we have that big group that you guys are always. Thank you guys so much, by the way. You guys are always going live in there, and every Tuesday, you guys doing your what's it called?
Creative Finance Collective. Yeah.
Yes. Yep, that's great. So everybody's in there listening to it and giving education. So it's seller financing homes, or you can just go to my website and there's links to all the different socials. So it's Mark, the Monroe.com, Mark MARK Monroe.com. But you guys, thanks so much for always providing value. We really need people like yourselves out there pushing this. And as you guys see, sometimes in my seller financing group, I'm always trying to educate people, and people think, oh no, this is the way to do it. Well, all we're trying to do is just help educate people. That's all we're doing. And that's why we want you guys always helping too. So thank you guys as well.
Yeah, no, happy to be there. Again, Mark Monroe, thanks so much for being with us. Let's do it again soon.
Absolutely. Take care, guys.
Be well. Take care. Bye-bye. With that, everybody, that is our show. Make sure to join us this afternoon for the Collective and next week for the show. We'll see you then.
Have a good day, everyone.